You're listening to an exclusive episode of the Can You Just Sit With Me podcast. I'm your host, Natasha Smith. In this 6-episode series, I engage in heartfelt conversations with individuals who intimately understand the depths of pain, hardship, and sorrow. Come and sit with us as we embark on essential conversations about the universal experiences of loss and grief, offering companionship in your journey, igniting hope, and nurturing your faith. You think of a moment when you wanted to ask someone, can you just sit with me?
Yeah, and actually, what was good for me was I didn't even yet know that's what I needed to proactively ask.
That's
But
good.
I had two friends in particular, and I talk about them in the book. Both of them, they're pastors' wives at the church I was at and at the church I'm at now. And both of them, we still share a friendship. Both of them lost their dads
Mm.
unexpectedly and quickly early in life. So one's dad drowned
Ah,
in his 50s, I think, or maybe early 60s, and the other one had a very aggressive form of cancer and died very, very quickly in his 50s as well.
mm.
And so their suffering was very different than what I was going through,
Yeah,
and yet both of them just knew to show up.
that's so awesome.
And I remember one just bringing me, just saying, I'm going to go pick you up lunch and I'm going to bring it over and let's just sit. And I felt like I didn't even know her that well. I'm like, oh, well, that was just an interesting thing that she offered to do. And then it kind of dawned on me after a while. She was just being there with me.
Mm.
And afterwards, what a grace it was that she just showed up.
Yeah.
And the other one came after I got a difficult second diagnosis. Um, I had breast cancer, and then they kept finding more things,
Hmm.
and they found a tumor in my abdomen. And at that point, it ended up being okay. It wasn't cancerous, but I had to have surgery on it. But at that point, we didn't know, and it
Yeah.
was just this really scary unknown thing.
Hmm.
And she just said, can I come over? I'm like, yes, you can come over. And she sat with me while I railed. I was mad, I was scared, I was confused, and I just ended up not having to do that by myself.
Yeah.
And because she had gone through her own traumatic situation with her dad, she just could take it. She
Hmm.
wasn't threatened by it.
Yeah.
I felt
Mhm.
like if there was anybody else, they would have like, oh my gosh, you are in a bad shape, lady.
Mhm.
But she knew how that was and just allowed me to process all of those questions and anger and fear. And she wasn't threatened by it. And it was such a gift.
The thing is, when we are in the real, raw emotion of pain, suffering, loss, grief, the presence of someone else is everything. Just their presence. No opinion, no advice, no wise words, simply their presence. Something that I read in your book as well, how just in describe how you described that was just beautiful with her being able to just sit with you and take it and be okay with you not being okay and you expressing your frustration, anger. But I think you had one had mentioned in the book how it's frustrating if you're trying to talk with someone who can't relate in that way.
Right. Yeah. And I did learn, I think I refer to a passage in scripture that talks about folks who have suffered being able through their suffering to better walk with you. And
Yeah.
the thought settled in my mind, maybe others are disabled. Like they have
Mhm.
not yet been abled by God work in their own life. And for me to be able to give them grace,
Mhm.
that they were not equipped to come alongside of me, and that was okay. And it didn't mean they were a bad person. And just in this season of my life, they're not going to be the person that's most helpful to me.
Yeah.
And I have a friend who suffered a lot before I did. And looking back, I think she and I can both say I was disabled during that season with her.
Mhm.
But then when I started suffering, she was able because she had been through a lot before me.
Yeah.
And her presence with me during my suffering really taught me a lot. And it made me realize how bad of a friend I had been with her. But she could give me the grace that at that point I wasn't, well, I didn't know. I hadn't really been taught. I hadn't yet experienced suffering. So I was kind of disabled when she was going through it. But now she's able to help me. And now I've grown in it and I can help others.
Mhm.
But it definitely is a mentality that's helpful to me so that I don't become bitter or angry
Yeah.
with folks who I wish had been better there for me.
Mhm. That is I love that so much. Abled and disabled to help because of basically the experiences that we have, the things that we've been through, and
Right.
just be able to give people the grace who have not experienced it. And so it's just kind of when, thinking about grief and suffering and pain, how we can help people to become more aware. I think it's so important just to, I guess, add in this conversation of grace, having grace for both the abled and the disabled. That's so good.
Yeah, and I tried to include and at the end of my book some practical helps, things
Yes.
that had really been helpful to me that I learned the hard way. And one of the things that I think is really helpful is to stop asking people to let you know if they need something. Because I realized I did that all the time, and it was a cop out for
Yeah.
me to feel like I had engaged the person that was hurting or suffering. But in the end, it put the initiative on them when they're probably flat out, they don't need to be the one tasked with taking the initiative.
Right.
And so I learned just this simple tweak of asking someone specifically, because this is what people did for me.
Mhm.
We would like to pay for someone to clean your house. The
Mm.
church ladies got together and they came over and offered to pay for someone that cleaned somebody's house to come over and for 1 month clean my house.
Wow.
And or someone came, do you have something we can organize for you? So
Yeah.
they came over and organized my pantry. Um, Set up meals, of course, that's an obvious one, but just coming to me with very specific, can I take your boys to the fair?
Mhm.
Can we take your boys to this youth activity at church? um, those kind of proactive things as opposed to, well, I'm here. You just need to let me know. And that actually, now I get angry about it because you know what? It is not my responsibility as
Yeah.
the sufferer. You just need to know the entire point of the set of circumstances that I'm under is that I am not doing well. So
Right.
if you're looking at me to be the proactive one that keeps you informed, and I have known people at times
Right.
that got offended. Well, I didn't know. Well, did you call and ask? You didn't
Yeah.
know what, why did this person know and I didn't know? Well, maybe because they called and asked.
That's so true. Oh my goodness. Yeah. And so I wanted to get started on the idea of a companion during suffering. I know you have talked in your book or wrote in your book about the long marathon of suffering and those who are in the long marathon of suffering. And I wanted to read just this little, a few lines of what you wrote and kind of go from there, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah.
So it says, why cry? Why call out to friends for help? And more devastating to consider, why pray? I found there came a point in our journeys where when the tears cease, not because circumstances got better or the weight in our shoulder lightened, but simply because we are dehydrated. So can we just start there and kind of expand on that thought?
Yeah, I have reached the point in my suffering where I was wondering, why do I continue? Like, I'm just too worn out. You can't sustain that level of tears, that level of emotion. And, there were stories when the Eastern Bloc broke and people started going into orphanages in some of the third world European nations. And there were stories of children that had just stopped crying in the orphanages because there was no one to come to rescue them or to help them. And so they just learned self soothing techniques because no one else was going to care for them. And I realized there came a point where I felt like I was at that fork in the road. Like, why even reach out to God? Why even pray? Because it's not working. I'm not finding relief. And that's a rough place to get.
Yeah.
It's a really rough place to get. And then I was burdened for it when I saw myself. I mean, I had known enough from attachment theory and things I'd seen about these orphanages in the times past that I could tell what was happening
Mm.
in my own soul. And that was, I really had to do battle against that idea that God's not going to answer, so why even cry out?
Sometimes we come to a place in our journeys when we are simply tired and we don't feel like help is going to come, even help from God. And so we stop trying. One thing I loved about this conversation with Wendy is just how honest she was. And in her honesty, it helps us to understand that we are not the only one. We're not the only person that goes through bouts of loneliness. We're not the only person who is suffering. And so, in her honesty, she helps us to feel not so alone. So, continue to listen to the conversation.
Yeah. Wow. I read that and it resonated for one.
Yeah,
And I think for so many of us who suffer, and maybe haven't been able to put into words, or like you said, have seen about the orphanage, or haven't seen anything that they can say, oh, that's what's happening to me. Um, and so I love this quote from Elizabeth Elliot, and it says, "Who of us in the worst pit that we've ever been in needs anything as much as we need company?" So when I thought
well,
about that quote, I thought about companionship. And so I want to talk about companions during suffering, and just the idea that kind of goes along with the story that you just mentioned, and then this feeling of being othered
right.
in suffering.
Yeah, it definitely, especially I think social media does not help this at
Mm,
all. But when we are in sustained periods of suffering anymore, we have way too many windows in what seems like other people going on happily with their lives.
yeah. Mhm,
And I know I felt very much on the outside looking in at all the happy, shiny people going on with
mhm.
their lives. And I think if we do any bit of digging, we know that's actually not the case.
Yeah.
But when you're tired and overwhelmed, it just really feels like everybody else, that you're on the outside looking in at all the other people going on with their lives. And it's a very distressing, lonely alienating feeling. And that was really the catalyst in writing the book, was I both felt that way, but I also, at some level, if I could remove myself from the emotions, knew that's not actually true.
Mhm.
I'm not the only person. And if you dig a little bit deeper, others are very much suffering.
Yeah,
And oftentimes, the people putting on the shiniest, happiest front can have some of the worst suffering going on underneath.
absolutely. Mhm. I know even for myself, I kinda consider myself like a silent sufferer, like, I grieve so much in silence because I didn't have a or felt like at the time I had a safe place to kind of
Oh,
express,
right.
so I kinda wonder if that's the same with just, sufferers and people who suffer, they don't have, like, a safe place to say, "Hey, I'm really" they feel like they have to put on a happy, shiny face because they don't have anyone to turn to.
Right. That's right. And I know for a lot of the time, at my worst, I didn't want to. I would protect myself in group settings because I didn't want to break down. I couldn't sustain the emotion, so my choices were either not go out in public, or if I went out in public, try to insulate myself
Mm,
from the kind of things that would cause me to break down in public.
right.
Um, and so you just really enter a season of all kinds of pitfalls around you. You don't want to break down in public, but you also need people. You need to break down with and not be alone when you do it.
Mhm.
So it's kind of a catch 22.
It's so true. I think, when we're in a space where, even as you mentioned, like, we weren't taught how to act or to be helpful. I mean, we're just not taught these things, like how to, come alongside someone who's suffering. We're not taught how to come alongside someone who's grieving. So I want to ask the question, what do you think? Like, how can we help others to to become better in this area, especially those who haven't experienced? Like, is it possible, or do they have to experience some type of suffering or pain or grief in order to be helpful?
No, I think you can. And sometimes it's just as simple as humbling yourself to go to
Mhm,
someone and say, what would be helpful to you right now?
mhm,
What kind of response on my part would be helpful? And ask three specific things. Would this be helpful to you? Would
uh,
this be helpful to you? Do you need someone just to sit with you? What do you need? And not and be humble to hear it. Like, you've got to go in with a humble, responsive attitude that's not going to be offended. Because someone may need the freedom to say, well, what you actually did was not helpful,
that's true, that's good.
and you need to not be threatened by it. Have your identity secure in Christ. We believe this gospel that says we are forgiven and we can confess when we drop the ball
Yeah,
or when we outright sin against someone. We don't have to be threatened by those things, but a lot of us are.
mhm,
And a lot of us cannot handle the truth that actually how we have been handling or how we have been responding wasn't helpful.
yeah,
And so then someone doesn't feel free to tell us.
right. Mhm, that's so
But
good.
give someone the freedom to educate you and not be threatened or offended by their responses.
Mhm. So the things that you've been mentioning, um, even your description with your 2 friends, just in how they were able to come alongside. I was just been thinking about, like, just a description or just the characteristics of a good companion, or I don't wanna say good companion, but helpful to someone who's suffering. How would you describe that?
Well, I think that they are present and more present with their actions than their words.
Hmm.
And when they are present with their words, they're not lecture or advice, but maybe asking questions. I have one friend, and she's just so good. Like, oh, well, that's interesting. So, what has made you feel that way? And as opposed to, well, that's wrong. You should not feel that way. So we need to be present and open our mouth. It's okay to open our mouth, but it isn't okay to lecture or diminish. Like someone can tell you, "Wow, I am really wrestling with God." Well, why are you wrestling with me? You
Yeah.
shouldn't be wrestling with God. No, instead, you know, what I had was friends that were not threatened when I wrestled with God and could hold faith for me
Oh, that's
when
good.
I was struggling to hold it for myself. They
Mm.
believed for me and they would pray with me in belief. That's a really beautiful gift you can give someone
Yeah.
when they can't muster up the words, that you muster up the words in prayer with them. Father, my friend is struggling so much right now, and I know you love her. Help her feel your love for her right now when she can't see it through the fog right now. Father, I know you've got a good plan. Father, open her eyes to this, to your goodness around her and your surrender, your power at work for her. I mean, we need to hold these things in confidence for our loved one when they can't do it for themselves.
Oh, that is so good. That reminds me of, is it Moses with Aaron and her,
Yes, right.
you know, holding up his arms.
I
And it,
love that picture.
yeah. And it kind of goes back to what you were saying about, we get to a point when we feel like we've cried and can't cry anymore and just dehydrate it. But
Yeah.
if we have those that can come alongside and pray for us when we can't pray, oh, wow, that is beautiful. So I kind of want to shift to this idea that you mentioned of a way forward in the midst of suffering, because it's different from, because when you, maybe if someone's reading it or seeing it, they may mistake it for being, just move on or just get over it, but it's totally different. So can you talk a little bit about the idea of a way forward in the midst of suffering?
Yeah. I was really moved by the name Joseph gave his son. And I talk about it in Companions in Suffering, and I talk about it in, I've got another book on the life of Joseph called I Forgive You. But he names his second son Ephraim, which sounds like the Hebrew word for fruitful. But then he describes it this way: because I have been fruitful in the land of my affliction. And that image of being fruitful in the land of your affliction. So, you spend so much of your suffering and your affliction trying to free yourself from the land of your affliction, right? We don't want to be
It's true.
in this land.
Hmm.
We want to get out of this place. But then for me, I spent a long time, particularly around my divorce and my ex-husband's mental health issues, trying to figure out how to free him, to free us from the effects of these mental health issues. And then you reach a point where you realize it's not going to go away. You
Yeah.
know, it isn't. All of the things that we know to do have not freed us from this. And then you go into a period. For me, it was just like a period of mourning, like, oh my gosh, my life is going to be so different than what I thought it was going to be. Our
Hmm.
family life, our family is going to look so different. And I can only see the depth
Yeah.
to the things I thought we would be. And so this name that Joseph gave his son just spoke to me of hope. Like, okay, so this is where my life's going to be. And it's totally different than the hopes and the thoughts I had in my 20s and early 30s of what a family would be like. but maybe something there's something that good that will come in this season too. Like maybe I can be fruitful even in this barren wasteland.
Mm,
And there's that other passage in the Psalm say that sow in tears will reap in joy.
yeah,
You sow the bag of seeds and come back carrying your sheaves with you. And that image too, like, is there a bag of seeds still at my feet, even in this land? Is there work for me to do in this land that's meaningful? And that I think a lot of us still really need meaningful work. We
yeah,
need something, and as women, if in our homes, if you have a husband, or you have children, a lot of that is the meaningful work that we're putting our hand to the plow to do. And then all of a sudden, it seems like this family is falling apart.
right.
And what of all the work I've put in already? And what's the value of,
Mm,
I don't even know how to invest in this family anymore. I don't know what to look for or look toward. And yet there was still meaningful work to do. There were still seeds to plant. There were still, the fields could still give fruit, even though they look like a barren wasteland. And this is God's miracle,
yeah.
that He can bring fruit even out of what feels like a barren wasteland.
Mhm.
And that fruit brings joy. And so it's not, get up and, make it happen,
Yeah.
but just the hope that there is still value to putting your hand to the plow, that there still is a bag of seed at your feet
Mm,
to plant in the ground, and that God will supernaturally work to bring fruit out of a barren wasteland.
yes. That is so beautiful. Can you kinda walk us through a little bit of how were you able to see this in your suffering? Because sometimes I know we can have these conversations, and to those listening, it seemed like it happened overnight, or it seems
Right.
like, "Oh, that sounds so easy, but we know it's not." So if you can just kind of, walk us through a little bit of how this kinda unfolded for you.
Well, for me, a really good friend that I sat with for a long time, because you're right, it's not instantaneous by any means, was Job.
Mm,
And what I did with Job, I knew I had to engage with God. So I was at that point, and this was right around my breast cancer diagnosis after my divorce, which really, really socked me for a loop,
yeah.
because I was just starting to get my feet up under me. And so the second thing on top of the first felt, and I even had a former pastor call me and tell me it had caused him to really doubt. He was really struggling with questions of God in the face of my breast cancer diagnosis on top of my
Mm,
ex-husband's situation. And
yeah.
that was disconcerting, but it certainly was doing it to me too. And there was nowhere in scripture. I knew I needed scripture, but I didn't really feel like it.
Mm,
So I did start in Job, and what I did was I put it on audio Bible, because my brain would not even handle sitting around reading the Bible.
yeah.
I was too agitated. I was really agitated. And I would walk. I have a loop around my farmhouse, a dirt loop, and I would walk that loop listening to Job. I fast forward through his friends because I didn't have the tolerance for that. And I would just keep listening to Job. Like I wasn't ready to hear God speak out of the whirlwind to Job.
Mm,
I just needed help articulating what I was feeling to God. And Job was such a helpful companion to me in that, to give me words to bring to God, because I had such angst and such anxiety and such fear and such struggle with who I thought God was and what I thought He was doing in my life. And now here we are in these type of circumstances. You kicked me when I was down, God. And Job was such a good companion because in the book of Job, it's bookended on the front end and the back end with God's affirmation of Job. And so I didn't want to deny God. I loved God. I was a faithful Christian. He had been my anchor through so many things in life. And so the fact that Job was still affirmed by God, even in that wrestling, it gave me, I don't know, the place that I needed to process it. And
Yeah.
so I would walk and I would pray these things to God. I'm like, God, you said Job, you affirmed Job, and he said this, and that is exactly how I feel.
Right.
But Job was also helpful to me to move. So
Mhm.
Job starts in the early part of the book, like, why was I even born? I wish I had never been born. Darkness, I just should have just been in the darkness. Darkness would be better to this.
Yeah.
And then somewhere a few chapters later, he starts to have not hope, but maybe there is a point to, maybe at least there's an afterlife that's worth living. He's still in misery in this earth. And then chapters later, and by Job 19, he's like, I know my Redeemer lives,
Yeah.
and I will stand in hope at the last day. And so his mourning and his wrestling moved me too. It moved him, but it moved me to the point, and it took a long time. I listened to the hard parts of Job over and over and over again before I was ready to hear from God in the whirlwind too. But lamenting with Job and using his words as my own wrestling prepared me to be able to hear God from the whirlwind, and for it not to sound, God's pretty stark in how he replies to Job, but going through that with Job, it brought me to a point where God's replies were grace to me, not like, how dare you say it that way, God?
Yeah.
But God's sovereignty and his power revealed at the end of Job became sustaining and secure. It secured me instead of threatened me or made me upset.
Mhm. Wow. That is so powerful. I love how you use Job as well as other biblical examples in your book to show us other companions in our sufferings, but this uh almost this visual I could or just this imagery I can just see and think and kind of hear Job in this conversation he has with God and how you use him as a companion because we can use him as a companion as well. And those who are listening and sitting and suffering in pain and grief right now can really use your example of bringing Job alongside during your suffering to kind of move you to this way forward. I love this, and even as you mentioned, kind of use his words because I know even in like in deep pain and suffering, you don't have words. It's like words can be fleeting. Like
Right.
you want to pray, but you're like, Lord help me. You know, it's like you're kind of depleted from how to express yourself, and so I love the idea of being able to grab these biblical examples um, to to mimic their words and to have a starting place or a jumping ground, and even listening to it because that's such a great um, practical thing that we can do as well when we don't feel like opening our Bible. Listening to it and digesting it that way. Oh, this is so good.
Yeah, it was very helpful to me.
Hmm. And so thank you for sharing that. How you kind of walked through that. And are there any other examples that, or is that like the main kind of how you've used Job's story? Is that how you did with others, or that was like kind of how like your way forward in the midst of your suffering kind of played itself out?
Well, no, I mean, there were, because it's not, for me, it wasn't like a straight path forward
Yeah.
from deep lament to hope, but it's
Yeah.
more circular. Like
Mhm.
it's the lament, and then, tears relief and release endorphins. And
Yeah.
so often after lament, I would feel a period of rest and then maybe some hope and work, movement forward. But then, there comes lament again. Like it
Yeah.
was not a straightforward path for me.
Yeah.
I had multiple cycles of lament. And sometimes it would be Job, sometimes it would be like Psalm 69 really meant a lot to me, Psalm 73, and at really dark times, Psalm 88 is the one psalm that doesn't end with anything, any positive. Like, and it
Mhm.
was helpful to me when I didn't want to, I wasn't ready to hear anything positive. I just
Mhm.
wanted to be able to articulate my pain to God.
Yeah.
And Psalm 88 is an interesting psalm in that it never goes forward positively. It
Mhm.
just laments.
Yeah. I think
But
that's so important for those who are listening as well to understand that that's okay.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because that was so important to me to know that God preserved in his eternal word these things so that we would have language.
Yeah.
And it helped me to, like John 11 where Jesus wept.
Yeah.
It helped me to know that he was moved, he mourned the sin and the death and the sickness and the suffering in the world, even as he had come to bring us hope and redemption and heal.
Mhm.
He also mourned all that was wrong with the world. And so you have a companionship even with
Yeah.
Jesus
Yeah.
himself.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, it just reminds me of, again, kinda going back to our earlier conversation about having someone who understands or have been through it, and of course,
Yeah,
Jesus, our high priest, who has, in all points, have felt everything that we have.
right,
So he's just a great companion in our suffering. Um, I guess it kind of as we kind of move to a close, what would you kind of speak into or speak to those who are listening, who are in that moment or in this season, um, where they're dehydrated
right.
and they don't really see a light at the end of the tunnel. They're in a dark place and it feels really hopeless.
Yeah, a hopeful prayer when you're at that place is at the end of Ephesians 1. And I would go to this one a lot of times where I felt like, Lord, I need some encouragement. And Paul prays at the end of Ephesians 1 that God would open their eyes to the power at work in them, to the hope of their calling. It's a really beautiful prayer, but what it is a prayer of need that, in theory or faith says that we have a hope, right?
Yeah.
But Paul recognized that the Ephesians needed God's supernatural help
Mm,
to open their eyes. And I've often had to pray that,
yeah.
Lord, open my eyes in some way to your power at work, to your, you know, the hope I have. What hope do I have? I feel hopeless
Yeah.
right now and just desperate for God to open my eyes to him doing something. And what it would always be would be not a change to my circumstances, but a change to my perspective. And I
Mm,
always felt like God met me in that prayer.
yeah.
And it was never changing my circumstances. It was never fixing the problem. It was his gift of grace in my head so that I could see the hope, my eternal hope. And we just need him to open our eyes sometimes to that. So that's my encouragement. Open up to the end of Ephesians 1, or put it on your audio Bible if you are not at a place where you can process reading it, and just make that your prayer. Father, open my eyes to the hope that I have, because I know that hope endures despite these circumstances, but these circumstances are clouding. They're the cloud in between me and my ability to hope, or to see my hope that I have, this eternal hope. And that eternal hope means something.
Mm,
And it really does break into the suffering that and the weights that we're carrying right now on earth. So
yes.
that prayer meant a lot to me.
Wow. That's so beautiful, Wendy. Oh, I have enjoyed this time with you. Wow. Um, Thank you so much for just taking the time to sit with me today and just to share about this subject of suffering and having companions in our suffering, and just giving us even hope, even in the midst of suffering, and a way forward. So, thank you so much for sitting with me.
Yeah, thank you, Natasha. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope it's encouraging to those who listen.
Wow, what a powerful conversation. At the latter part of our conversation, I am literally wiping away tears because Wendy's words resonated so much with me. I hope you enjoyed this episode with my guest, Wendy Alsup. Find helpful resources from this episode in the description, including my book, Can You Just Sit With Me? Healthy Grieving for the Losses of Life, and Wendy's book, Companions in Suffering, Comfort for Times of Loss and Loneliness. Be sure to share, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you stream. Thanks again for sitting with me.